Okay, guys, welcome to our first session on Oedipus the King. So, like we do at the beginning of all of our sessions, what we're going to do is kind of take a step back and try to get the context of the play and what exactly it is that we are going to look at in particular. Now, uh, this is a very significant text in that really you can approach it in multiple ways, right? It's very rich with meaning, and there are a lot of themes and sub-themes, okay, that are at play, that are being animated throughout the text. And historically, it has been one of the most cited uh, pieces of nonfiction by philosophers, precisely because it has so much meaning, and precisely because it has so many, if you want to say, kind of like lessons and whatnot. And this is not by mistake. Sophocles, the author, is intentionally trying to articulate his own or his epic's own um, philosophical outlook on the world, right? Which is beginning to emerge now in Greek civilization. So, what do we do with all of the lessons? What do we do with all of the things that we can learn? What we're going to try to do is to focus on one particular theme in the text, and that is the question of know thyself, the concept of truth, right? And when we talk about the concept of truth, right, and know thyself, what's the relationship between the two? Well, when I say the word truth, this is somewhat abstract, right? What does truth mean? What is the theory of truth and so forth? Um, but a more precise way of articulating this and a way that allows us to relate more to the protagonist is the truth that is sought out when we ask the question, what am I? Right? Or the imperative of know thyself, right? Know who you are, what you were intended for, what your origin was, and so forth. And the idea is that this is what sets up, like we said earlier, essentially it reveals your fate and it also reveals your destiny. So we'll find that for the ancient Greeks, the question of know thyself is not just a question of my past, but it is also a question of, okay, what do I do now in the future? What do I do, or what will be my fixed fate in the future? Now, before we jump into this, what exactly does it mean to know thyself? In the modern world, when we think about know thyself, we tend to think about our occupation, right? About our nation of origin, about our ethnicity. Now, what the Greeks okay, sorry about that. So, uh, when we think about the question of know thyself, right, in the modern world, we tend to think of it in terms of what my occupation is, or what I the function that I have in society, and so forth. Now, for the Greeks, the question of know thyself was a far more fundamental question, and it could not be reduced to what my function in society is. So essentially, it was a question of um, what is my place in the cosmos? What is my place in the general order of things? And what Oedipus represents is the emergence of this new type of Athenian man, right? This man who is in pursuit of the truth, despite all of the negative elements that inhibit him from doing so. Now, you might recall how we discussed uh, early into the course that there is always this pursuit of authenticity, right? and that what makes the pursuit of authenticity difficult is precisely the fact that there are always obstacles that will prevent you from fulfilling your authenticity, from fulfilling your purpose, from fulfilling the know thyself, right? And these include internal obstacles and external obstacles. So in the case of uh, um, Oedipus, we find there are multiple obstacles, and yet he still perseveres and moves forward, and then eventually discovers the truth to his own dismay. It is a tragic truth. So, with that being said, we can look at the text essentially as Oedipus coming to awareness, consciousness of the cosmos, right? Consciousness of himself. And if you remember the analogy of waking up in an empty room, or when the young child becomes conscious of the universe, he begins to ask questions. So this is what's taking place in the text that we are going to read. So the text begins, as you can see in the screen. Let's find it. First, obviously, we start in the city of Thebes, and then quickly we move to the temple, the temple of Apollo. Okay, so what's significant about the temple of Apollo? The temple of Apollo was really built on one question, or one imperative, one command, which is know thyself. Okay, now this might seem different. This represents a sort of shift from the Homeric worldview towards a new kind of curiosity, and we'll see why. We'll see why that's even possible in this context. So the imperative at Temple of Apollo is essentially know thyself, but we will see some of the difficulties that obstruct us in knowing thyself, right? So you can think about your own case, for example. If you were to pursue the question of who am I, right? You can begin to think about some of the obstacles. So for example, it might be distractions, right, at home. It might be your occupation. It might be the desire for fame. It might be that the people, right, that your community discourages you from pursuing the truth. In, for example, instead enjoining on you to pursue material wealth, right? So an example of this would be, if you were to pursue a particular science out of love for, the truth and for objectivity, and, society would tell us something like, oh, well, that's not going to procure you a good job or something of that sort, right? So this tension, this desire to know thyself, and the obstacles are themes that continue to play out even in our modern society. And why do they continue to play out? Precisely because these are features of the human condition. The curiosity of man and the wonder that man has is a fundamental feature of our human condition. Why is that the case, right? Because the self is always present, right? You are always present to yourself. It's true that, for example, your parents may not be present, right? They may be there and then not be there. The same thing applies to everyone in your life, but the one constant being that always imposes itself on you is your own self, right? And the self will ask questions about itself, about its own origins. So it's kind of, if you want to think of it this way, that the know thyself is to question the obvious, to question what has always been there, but had in a sense been forgotten, which is the self, the I, right? So if I were to use myself as an example, instead of me asking who is Ahmed or who is Mustafa, I would take a step back and say, okay, well, who is Ali? Who am I, right? I would inverse the thinking to begin to think inwardly, right? And we find that this is when Gilgamesh pursued this question, he was always thinking externally, outward, right? He was trying to find meaning in the outside world, and he did not reflect on himself. There was no self-consciousness, And we saw why, right? We saw because there were many distractions, the distractions of the everyday world, of aesthetics, of pleasure, of power, and his own hubris, and of course the gods obstructing his, as the case with Odysseus, for example, obstructing his pursuit um, of know thyself. Now, there is a wonderful contemporary movie about this topic, and I would go as far as saying it's an adaptation of Oedipus the King, and it is called The Truman Show. So The Truman Show involves, the actor Jim Carrey, and essentially it is about an individual who is born and raised in a community that seems to be all too perfect, okay? And similar to the Matrix, right? And then over time, he begins to notice some glitches, some inconsistencies in the order in the world around him. And he begins to ask questions about the self. Who am I? What are my origins? So he begins to look into his origins, who his father was, where he was born, and so forth. And he keeps coming up to a dead end. Now, later in the movie, we discover that he is actually living in a dome, right? And this dome has a director, and that he is actually on live TV the whole time. So throughout his life, he had been an actor playing a role in a dome in a carefully constructed reality, right? And he is given the choice through his own will, through his own assertion, to leave or to stay. So to leave would essentially be to plunge into the unknown, right? To create a world for himself. To stay would be essentially to stay within the confines of the illusionary truths that were dictated onto him by the director and essentially by those who write the script. And again, similar to the movie in the Matrix. And one of the reasons that this is relevant is because it's a very good metaphor for our lives, right? When we want to ask, who am I, or we want to pursue the question of know thyself, well, the first question we need to ask is, who's been defining it all along, right? Who has been writing the script? Which politician, which intellectuals, which educational system, and so forth, right? Had I been dictated a false pretense about know thyself, or has it been obscured? Has it been concealed? Or is this what life really is, right? That I merely have a social role, a political role, that I am the member of a sect or a party or an institution and so forth. So this curiosity is really what drives Oedipus the King, and it will be also what drives, as we will see later on, Augustine and Ghazali and so forth. It is a desire to know thyself, and the self cannot be known independently of questioning what is one's place in the cosmos, not just what is one's place in society. Now, the question with regards to what is my place in the cosmos is a relational question, meaning that it pertains not to the I as an isolated being, but as a being that is in relation to an other. Okay. So when I say what is my place in the cosmos, what I am asking is what we call a metaphysical question. Metaphysics simply refers to the structure of reality. What do I perceive to be the structure of reality? What is the relationship between man and man, and how is this relationship defined, determined by the man-God or the man-absolute relationship, right? So every particular community or society, or every individual who is in pursuit of the truth, essentially wants to arrive at a metaphysics. He wants to try to understand the structure of reality in order to understand what is his place in reality, right? In order to understand your place in reality and your place in the cosmos, you have to deal with the question of, well, what is reality, right? Is it a singular whole that is this grandiose idea? Is the world just one big consciousness? Is it merely a dialectic between different material forces? Is it constituted by two substances, the mind and the soul? And what is my relationship with God or the gods, right? Is it a relationship of trust, of benevolence, uh, benevolence? Is it a relationship of antagonism, and so forth? So the text that we are going to deal with is essentially a pursuit of a metaphysics, a pursuit of know thyself by thinking inwards and by daring to ask the boldest of questions, which is, who am I? And we will find that this is a dangerous question precisely because when you ask this question, no, who am I? It has the potential to disrupt your existing relations, right? So in Oedipus, there is a reason why his wife and the oracle and the chorus, the people, are telling him to stop asking questions, because it would mean that he now has to escape the bliss of ignorance, the bliss of illusion, right? Or the manufactured worlds or comfort zones that had been set up. That it means that he cannot reduce his purpose to his social or political role, but rather he must ground himself in a greater role. And why does this disrupt your existing relations and disrupt your existing identity? Well, because it gives yourself a higher meaning.
It gives the self a higher meaning. Okay. Hopefully, let me see if the mic is still working. Okay. So this is I mean, this is very significant for multiple reasons, right? That if you, for example, all your life, right, you defined your purpose and your function in terms of the role that you have in society. So I am, for example, let's say I were a doctor, right? So my purpose, my identity is to be a doctor, right? And this might be a medical doctor, and this might be prestigious, right? Now, if we were living in the world of Gilgamesh, right? Gilgamesh, and we asked the same question, know thyself. And what we discovered was essentially that we are merely specks of dust in the cosmos, right? This is who we truly are. That's, of course, not necessarily true. But what would this do to my identity and my ego as being a medical doctor? It would disrupt it, right? Now, what happens with Oedipus, right? When Oedipus is a king, a mighty, wise, powerful king, right? What happens when the truth is revealed? What happens to his status and his pride as a king, right? So it is precisely because the truth is so disruptive at the individual and at the collective level that we can say that the one who pursues the truth is essentially a hero, because he partakes in a journey which we as listeners would have otherwise avoided, right? But he dares to ask the questions that that the people, the common man in the play or in our society today don't want to ask and willingly don't ask, right? So this is briefly what the text is about, and we're going to see how does he go about pursuing the truth, and how does he go about discovering it, and then what is his reaction. Now, we said that we have the temple of Apollo, right? And the temple of Apollo is located within the city, right? Within the city of Thebes. And there are several important things to know about the city of Thebes, right? Or the nature of the city-state in Greeks for the Greeks at that time. The first was that there were two sets of laws. Okay, there was the law of the city, the law that is produced by the state, the government, right, the prevailing authorities at that time. So it's the law of the city, and these laws are relative, right? These laws are subject to change. And they're relative because the subject that produces them is relative, i.e. man, society. And then you have the law of the absolute. So the law of the absolute refers to the fixed, unchanging structure of reality. Today, for example, we perceive them to be the laws of nature, or the dialectics of matter, right? Material forces in classical Marxist thought, or the will of God, right, in Christian thought and so forth. So you have the law of the city and you have the law of the absolute, right? And we find that there is, in many cases, somewhat of a tension between the two, right? The relationship between the two is not a transparent relationship. And we also have in this schema two ways of seeing the world. Okay, you have the actual physical seeing, right, which is sight, and this is what we use to organize the laws of the city, right? It's quantitative, and it allows us to know the place of the merchants, procure trade, calculate our military expenditures, and so forth. But then you have another form of seeing, which is absolute seeing. And this refers to prophecy, i.e. absolute seeing refers to your ability, or the ability of the oracle, in this case, of the prophets, to see beyond the immediate material world, beyond the quantitative, beyond the surface of things, and try to discover or look into the inner meaning of things, right? So with absolute seeing, or in Arabic we call this al-basira, right, versus al-nazar, which is sight. Basira is, right, this type of seeing that is penetrative, that allows you to see but is behind the veil. And the reason why this type of thinking is so important for the Greeks at that time is because it allows them to understand the place that different material things have within the larger structure of reality, right? So, for example, the sun, the moon, the individual, the community become signs that point to something beyond itself, such as order and so forth, right? So, with that being said, now we can go on to the actual text. So this is the setup, basically, that we have Oedipus pursuing the truth, and if we want to say, let's say the actors, right, involved are Oedipus and his wife. Sorry, you have Oedipus on the one hand, and then on the other hand you have his wife, the oracle, and the people. Now, this sets up a very interesting situation. We find that what is obstructing Oedipus's pursuit of truth, is three types of people. Okay, three groups of people: his family, his society, the political community, the social economic community, and the oracles, which is the religious class. Now, you would expect, for example, that a family would be supportive of such a pursuit, but his wife understands that this would disrupt him being his function as a husband. Similarly, you would expect that the oracles, right, who are prophets, would support this pursuit, but similarly, we find that they actually try to discourage him. Why? Because the oracles know that the truth is tragic. And similarly, the people discourage him precisely because they know that this would disrupt his function as a king, right? As the king of Thebes. So these are the actors that are set up. We have Oedipus on one hand versus the oracle, or we can say uh, the church, the religious institution, the community, and the family. So how is this text essentially different from the Odyssey? There are several key differences. The first is that the cosmos that Oedipus inhabits is ordered. Okay, there is order to the universe, right? Whereas with Odysseus and Oedipus, we found that it was not ordered and it was not predictable. Why? Because you have multiple interfering gods. Okay. Now, with Oedipus, these gods are replaced by absolute fate, with history. And history takes up the role of the unchanging, i.e. fate. And the role of the gods is merely to dispense, to implement the dictates of history and time. Right? So what does this mean? This means that now there is a sense of order. And not only is there a sense of order, but there is a sense of beauty to the universe. Okay? However, the catch is that this order is not made fully comprehensible to man. It is not transparent, right? It is always shrouded in riddles, right? For example, the riddle of the Sphinx and so forth. And that the truth, despite the fact that the world is ordered, the truth can only be seen by Tiresias, who is a non-human, right? And it is not that he creates the truth, but that he discovers it on behalf of man. So importantly, that time becomes a god in and of itself, whereas the immortal and powerful gods are not absolute, but they merely implement what time dictates upon us. So, for example, implementing the fate of Oedipus in one way or another. And we find also something very interesting. We find a clash because the universe is ordered, but the truth is concealed. We actually find in the debate between Oedipus and the oracle, right, a very interesting confrontation. Basically, a confrontation between man who claims sovereignty of the world and those who claim sovereignty over the cosmos, right? So this tension between the worldly and the cosmic, the worldly and the metaphysical, the subjective and the absolute, right? This tension between the two plays out in the argument that is happening between Oedipus and the oracle. Now, what does this tell us essentially about Greek civilization at large? Okay, basically, the emergence of an ordered universe that is beautiful, that is absolute, that is predictable, but is concealed, and the portraying of Oedipus as being a kind of man who pursues the truth is Sophocles' way of inaugurating or introducing us to a new radical period of Greek philosophy, which is the last half of the 5th century. And this was a century where prophecy and religious institutions were being called into question. And there was an intellectual revolution, right? There was an intellectual revolution, and we were slowly moving into a new golden rule, which is that man is the maximum of all things. Man is the measure of all things. So essentially, the Oedipus is revolting against the concealment of the truth. He's revolting against those who protect the truths and the secrets of the cosmos, which is the religious institution of his time, right? And this is a very significant move, because this is really what inaugurates, at least symbolically, the intellectual revolution that will allow us to go from Homer to Plato, right? That will give Plato the grounds needed to begin saying, okay, this is truth and this is falsehood, and so forth. So essentially, Oedipus's pursuit represents a kind of attitude that the Greeks were beginning to have over their own selves and over their own actions, right? This idea that we can no longer relegate our fate or knowledge of our fate to the religious establishment, but we must have the courage of asking bold questions, right? And this is also plays out in warfare, right? We find at this time that the Greeks begin to say things such as that we were victorious in the battle over Persia, for example, not because of the luck given to us by the gods, but essentially because of our own intelligence, right? What I'm trying to say, in summary, is that what we have is the emergence of the man as action, man as rebel, right? Man as a questioner of the truth. The emergence of this type of man, and this will unfold up until the Enlightenment period. And we will see, I mean, even today, right? Generally, when we think about the truth, we generally think of the truth as being something which we can discover, right? And this is largely that we've inherited a certain legacy, right? We've inherited a certain conception of man that has its roots as early as the text of Oedipus the King. Okay, so it's very important that you kind of have a solid foundation of what I have said in this lecture. I have tried my best to simplify it and to summarize it and to give you the contextual background. So inshallah, on Thursday, what we will do is we will look at each, we will go through the play and begin to address the themes in detail. Now, when you are reading Oedipus the King, the theme that we will be exploring is the theme of truth, man as a question, right? Man as man as the entity that raises the question of from where from, right? Who am I? Or like Heidegger says, it is the being that raises the question of being. The entity, the living, breathing man or woman who can question his or her own existence, right? And who can engage in the joys of thinking and the dangers of thinking and to partake in the courage required to think and the boldness that is required to think, right? As opposed to remaining ignorant or self-deceit or what we can refer to as bad faith. But we will go into these in detail, inshallah. See you guys next week. Tomorrow.